everyone who is joining us today on this webinar. I have the distinct pleasure of co-presenting with Judge Elizabeth Berns, and I just want to tell you a little bit about Judge Berns, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Judge Berns began her legal career working with the State Attorney General's Office, Division of Labor and Industry, doing workers' compensation law. She then opened her own practice where she spent the next 2 decades supporting individuals, families, and businesses in the areas of workers' comp, estate planning, and probate, business and intellectual property, and family law. Judge Berns has been active helping others understand domestic violence, sexual assault, and the impact of trauma exposure. In 2009, she did begin serving her community as a pro tem judge in municipal courts and King County District Court as a pro tem commissioner in King County Superior Court. Judge Berns joined the King County Superior Court bench in January of 2013. She has co-authored chapters in the Sexual Offense Bench Guide for Judges and in the Domestic Violence Manual for Judges. She is the project chair for the King County Domestic Violence and Child Maltreatment Coordinated Response Oversight Committee and is also the judicial lead for the King County Superior Court's Trauma Care Product. She is on the advisory board for the Center for Children and Youth Justice e-Quarterly Project, a national advisor to the Battered Women's Justice Project, on the faculty for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges judicial education programs entitled Enhancing Judicial Skills in Domestic Violence Cases, and she is on the Board of Governors for the American Judges Association. So I want to give a warm welcome to Judge Berns, who is joining us from Washington and putting aside her very hectic court docket to be able to join us today. So welcome to Judge Berns. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Elaina Roberts, and I am the legal director of the Stalking Resource Center. The Stalking Resource Center is a program of the National Center for Victims of Crime, and we are based out of Washington, D.C. We always like to give a shout out to our funder. We are funded by DOJ's Office on Violence Against Women, and that is who allows us to do the training and the technical assistance that we do all around the world. To give you an overview of where we're headed for the next probably 50 minutes, we want to start out by looking at the prevalence of stalking as well as what some of the stalking tactics typically are occurring when someone is trying to monitor, surveil, and track somebody. We'll look at the intersection with other crimes, including domestic violence and other crimes, and then we'll end with some case examples. So that's just an overview of where we're headed. Let's go ahead and get started by looking at what the prevalence rates of stalking are across the United States. We know that 7.5 million people are stalked in the U.S. every single year. And if you break this down by gender, that's 4% of women and 2% of men. You can also break that down over the course of a lifetime. If you're curious what your prevalence rates are in your own jurisdiction, since I know so many of you are from across the U.S., you basically want to figure out what your population is, break it into your female population and your male population, and then take 4% of women and 2% of men, and that'll give you the statistical number of how many stalking cases you should be seeing come through your courts. That said, given that the high prevalence rate of stalking exists, we know that stalking is a crime that is rarely charged. In fact, only between 5 and 16% of cases are actually charged as stalking when the police have all the information that they need under their state statute in order for it to be charged. We also know that stalking, not only is it not being charged regularly, but it is, as many other crimes, an underreported crime by victims. And so what is it about stalking cases that makes it so challenging? In other words, why isn't it being charged as frequently as some of the other crimes that we see coming through the court system? I think first and foremost, what makes stalking such a difficult crime to work with, whether you're a judge hearing these cases, if you're a police officer, even if you're a victim advocate working one-on-one with that victim, the number one thing with a stalking crime that makes it difficult to identify is the context. Context is absolutely critical in a stalking case. We know that fear, if you read all of your state statutes on stalking, you know that fear is a critical element in every stalking statute. And fear, unfortunately, is subjective. And so what makes you afraid of something might not make me afraid of something. We are not afraid of the same things, and even if we are afraid of the same thing, we will experience that fear at different levels. And so putting the behaviors that the stalker is doing into context is absolutely critical. You may not think those letters, those flowers, showing up at, random places, you may not think that that is scary or that you would be afraid in and of itself, but you have to understand the context at which those behaviors are happening to understand why that victim is afraid. Another thing is that individual acts may not be criminal in and of themselves. So throughout today, and this is part one of a two-series webinar, we know that individual acts may not be criminal. So we'll be talking a lot over the next two webinars about things like text messages, phone calls, emails, sending presents, things that in and of themselves aren't criminal. And so it makes it that much more difficult to identify the pattern of behavior or the course of conduct that this person is engaging in. Statutory elements, I mentioned this, so fear, very subjective, and fear is an element in every single statute. Sometimes it's a reasonable person standard, asking would a reasonable person in a victim's shoes feel fear, and sometimes it's an actual fear standard. Did the victim actually feel fear because of the stalker's behaviors? So you want to figure out exactly what your state statute is calling for, but every statute has a fear element. And finally, we know that evidence and technology evidence, that just presents a whole different realm of issues that judges and victim service providers and law enforcement officers are having to deal with. So either trying to connect that evidence to the offender, and as prosecutors trying to authenticate that evidence, that can be challenging. And then also dealing with what I like to call just false evidence. We'll look at the next webinar at things like spoofing emails, evidence that really can be faked, and how do you then determine if, in fact, you should allow that in your courtroom. Finally, intersection with other crimes. We know that stalking frequently intersects with many different crimes. In fact, this next slide is going to show you just how many crimes stalking can and often does intersect with. And when you're looking at this list, I'm sure a lot of these look familiar to you because you hear these types of cases. And I almost think it might be easier to come up with crimes that stalking might not intersect with. Because really, stalking is, again, that tracking, that monitoring, that pursuant behavior that forms a pattern of behavior. And it really can predate or precede any of these crimes. It can also come after some of these crimes as well.
Thanks, Elaina. And getting back to the prevalence of this and looking at some of the numbers, I think that the numbers also indicate that women are more likely to be victims in stalking, generally speaking, and men are more likely to be stalkers regardless of the victim gender. So that's an important factor to keep in mind when contemplating the numbers. And I will spend just a minute or two talking about numbers to give some context to how we're addressing some of the challenges and recognizing stalking when it comes into our systems and when you touch it from your different perspectives, as well as really what we're dealing with. Context is everything. So generally speaking, when we think about stalking, we're contemplating, we're learning that it's a course of conduct. It's directed at a specific person that creates an implicit or an explicit threat and induces fear or concern for the personal safety of that person or the safety of close others, such as a child or family member or partner. I have the privilege of presiding in a very diverse community in Seattle, Washington, and my court, which is a court of general jurisdiction, serves 2 million people. And it's only been in the last couple of years that stalking has come to the court as a standalone, and what I mean by that is that it's come on its own petition based on some of the changes in our laws, bringing it to light as an independent offense. We see a lot of it in the civil side. We see a lot of it on the criminal side. So just to give you an idea of some numbers, on the civil side, between 2015 and 2016, we had 1/3 of the petitions that were filed in our court resulted in stalking orders, independent stalking orders, and that number was less than 20, compared to a domestic violence protection order, which was 1,100. So you can see a really big difference there. And when Elaina and I talk a little bit later about how this is embedded, especially in domestic violence and intimate partner violence, that'll make some sense. On the criminal side, looking at no contact orders, sexual assault protection orders, and stalking orders in the same period of time, again, we had less than 20 stalking orders, independent stalking orders. But our no contact orders were about 2,000 that year, and our sexual assault protection orders were about 500. So interesting, certainly not a comment about stalking, but it does tell us that for someone to bring in stalking as an issue to the courts, it takes a lot of, there are a lot of barriers to doing that, and you're going to see that offense, again, embedded in some of the other issues and cases that come in. Elaina talked about context, and it's so important for us to continue to understand that, each act that occurs, each course of conduct that's directed at a specific person in and of itself may not be a crime, may not violate our statute, but taken as a whole, it constitutes stalking. So with those numbers, and hopefully in your different jurisdictions, you can get a sense of how these cases are coming in. If you track cases in our court system in any way, and if you have a standalone stalking orders, that's going to be helpful just in understanding how they're coming to the court. But let's talk a little bit now about the kind of behavior, and then we'll pull it back out into different kinds of cases.
Yeah, thank you, Judge Berns, and you're absolutely right. As we go through some of this, we are going to spend some time talking about that intersection with domestic violence that you are referencing, and how I think domestic violence oftentimes overshadows the other crime, hence why we titled this Stalking the Hidden Crime. I think it's oftentimes the crime that gets eclipsed by these other, better known crimes. When we look at the pattern of behavior, right, because both Judge Berns and I have mentioned that stalking is a pattern of behavior. It's a course of conduct crime. So it's very unique in that respect, because you have to be looking for that pattern. It's not just one incident and done. And so when we look at that pattern, we see that 2/3 of stalkers pursue their victims at least once per week, and many pursue them daily. We see that almost 80% of stalkers will use more than one means of approach, and that just means they are constantly altering the means at which they're using to get at that victim. So they might start out with text messaging, but then the victim stops responding. So then they switch to social media and they're broadcasting things. Well, then, that doesn't work anymore. Now they're showing up at the victim's work. They're leaving flyers at the victim's gym, place of business, home, where they get their nails done. So they're really escalating their behavior, and they will constantly change what they're doing just to get that fear out of that victim. And we see that weapons are used to harm or threaten victims in about 20% of the cases. So I know that that doesn't sound like a huge percentage, and in fact it's not. It's less than a quarter of all stalking cases will have some type of weapon that's used to harm or threaten. But what's important to note, we're going to see this as we go through, is that it's our intimate partner stalkers who are the ones more likely to be using those weapons. So our intimate partner stalkers will be the majority of this 20% that you see here. And when it comes to recidivism, stalkers have a really high recidivism rate. And when we talk about recidivism, just to be clear, we're talking about the time between when there was some type of system intervention. So they got arrested, they got charged, they got served with a protection order. There has been some type of system intervention. And the time between when that happens and they recidivate can range anywhere from 1 day to 6 years. And those of you who are listening, I know there's quite a few of you, I am certain you have a case in mind where you know the moment that that offender got served with a protection order, they literally violated it within 30 seconds of being served. And so that happens very regularly. To put this in perspective, domestic violence re-abuse occurs in 24 to 60% of the cases. So those of you familiar with domestic violence, this should look familiar. But just to put it in perspective, stalkers, when they recidivate, they're starting out at the high end of domestic violence re-abuse. And again, our intimate partner stalkers, those that have had either a prior or current relationship with that victim, they will recidivate at an even higher rate than this.
And Elaina, can I just interject here and maybe offer, as we think about stalking, maybe offer sort of 4 compartments where we're going to see this behavior play out. And it kind of helps me keep things organized in my mind as well as understand really the complexity of this type of behavior. One compartment you can think of as surveillance, and I think that's initially when stalking came out, a lot of people just thought, oh, someone's following somebody else. And this surveillance, as many of you know, not only is about showing up, being in person somewhere, being visible, but it's also surveillance through technology, which is very, very concerning. Another compartment we could call life invasion, if you will, repeated unwanted contact by all sorts of means, whether it's phoning or texting or emailing or sending mail through third parties is very common, and then we have a whole social media area. The third compartment is intimidation. So this kind of gets back to the implicit or explicit threat that I mentioned earlier and just how we understand a definition of stalking. Forced confrontations, property damage, and even something like a threatened suicide can be all a part of intimidation. And then the last category that I offer up is one of interference. So trying in some way or another to disrupt someone's life, whether it's professionally or socially, and then that can also involve physical or sexual attacks. So just to offer those compartments as we start looking at this behavior and as we get into some of the tactics.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Judge Berns. I think you're absolutely correct in those different categories. Has it been your experience when we talk about the behaviors, though, that stalkers will engage in several of those, if not all of those categories, just to try to get at that victim?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, and we see that a lot. They are constantly, and the research backs that up. They're changing their tactic. They're changing how they're getting at that victim. The research, as you can see here, there are a number of different tactics that stalkers will use. And like we've been saying, they will change it from time to time just to get a different reaction from that victim. They are extremely manipulative. They're one of the more manipulative criminals, I think, in that they're constantly scheming how they can either manipulate people, third parties, or even some type of technology. And the technology part of this webinar will be in part 2. So if you're interested in how technology is being misused and how we need to be looking at the evidence that's coming from that, please join us in part 2 of the webinar. And you can find that both on the NCJ, FCJ website as well as the Stalking Resource Center's website. But here are all the different kind of categories that the SRC has come up with in terms of how stalkers will manipulate both systems and people. So if kids are involved, and we're going to look at kind of the statistics on the intimate partner stalkers in just a moment, but a lot of times there will be kids involved in this relationship, again, whether it's current or former. And so either the offender is gathering information from that child or, and this is really important to know, especially those of you who are hearing child custody, divorce, or protection order cases, if there are children involved, a lot of times those kids are being given some form of technology. It could be a cell phone that has spyware on it, or maybe it's been enrolled in a family locator plan. It could be a new laptop at which it has a very nice camera and speakers and the offender is able to access that. It could be a watch that has GPS in it, and anywhere that child is with that equipment, that's usually where the non-offending parent is, your victim. So very important to remember that kids are also being manipulated and used to track, monitor, and surveil the victim. We know that the legal system is frequently used, whether it's redoing child custody, redoing the divorce proceedings, or the offender is filing false police reports. They're the ones taking out the protection orders. They are spoofing themselves to make themselves look like they are the victim. We know that when it comes to protection orders, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, well over half of all victims say that their protection orders were violated. Again, this goes back to the recidivism rate. And when we look at our intimate partner stalkers, we see that over half of all intimate partner stalkers will use third parties or what's called proxy stalking. And it could be something as simple as using their friends who are reaching out via social media to the victim. Maybe they're posting things on their social media about the victim. It could be the stalker's mother, brother. It could manifest itself in a number of different ways, but just something to keep in mind, again, and I'm sure, Judge, you'll have a comment on this, if you're hearing these types of cases, just be aware that half of all intimate partner stalkers are using third parties to help them with their stalking.
Another note on that, I think, is that across our nation, we obviously have varying communities and a lot of marginalized communities. We're in urban, we're in rural areas. In the area that I preside in, I have a huge immigrant population, and that brings in some cultural factors. And this really can play into how these tactics are being used. If there's a tight community, the connection and the use of the sort of proxy stalking can really play out in that community. And so those are all just factors that you really want to think about. What community are you working within? What community are you serving? And are there inherent factors that will play into these tactics?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we want to ask you all, and this is a raise your hand. So I think Alicia had told you how to do that at the very beginning of this. Raise your hand if you have presided over a case that involved stalking behaviors, whether or not stalking was actually the charge that was listed. Go ahead and do that. Okay, I'm seeing them all pop up. Yeah, a lot of you. Okay. Yep, quite a few. Okay, so how about this then? Use the chat box, and this is just the chat box for everyone, just so that Judge Berns and I get an idea of what type of case it was. So this is a case that had stalking but wasn't charged as stalking. So what type of case was it? Yep. Domestic violence, DV, divorce.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of DVs. Oh, criminal trespass and
yeah.
criminal damage. Yep. Child custody, harassment. Oh, there's a child sex abuse. Sexual harassment, yes.
Yeah, human trafficking.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so as we mentioned before, you all are definitely seeing these behaviors come through your courtroom. Oftentimes, though, it's not based on the stalking charge. It's based on something else. But it's so great that you all are identifying what that is. And then by a show, and I know many of you are still, harassing communications. Yeah, keep typing. That's great. This is good information. Raise your hand if you have presided over a case that actually was charged as stalking. And I think for the most part, I'm thinking criminal. Let's see. Yep, a lot of you again. Quite a few of you have done this. Okay, excellent. Yeah, it's always good to know. And so I want to turn this back over to Judge Berns. She and I really, worked through this material for you all, but she definitely has been on the bench for a long time, has really great information for you. And so we wanted to ask Judge Berns to tell you more about some of her experiences and what she's seeing nationally. So Judge Berns, I'll go ahead and ask, how have you seen these cases present themselves, and really what should judges be looking for as they're hearing them, whether they're charged as stalking or not?
Great. Thanks, Elaina. And I think it really has to do with what you've all been typing about, where you've seen these issues, these tactics, and the kinds of cases. A lot of domestic violence, a lot of family law-related cases, that brings harassment into the mix, amongst other things. But a majority of you are really seeing that in that context. And that's really, I think, what a majority of the courts are seeing at this point across the nation, certainly in my jurisdiction, is that stalking is identified as a behavior or course of conduct within the either request for a civil protection or within the context of family law proceedings, a dissolution, child custody issues, even dependency matters for that, as well as on the criminal side of things. So and very seldom do we see it, as you could remember from some of the numbers I shared from my jurisdiction, do we see it coming in as a standalone charge and as a standalone petition, resulting in a stalking order. So because it's embedded, what the courts and what judicial officers really need to be focusing on is what kind of behavior are they learning about and hearing about and seeing in each of these cases that come in. And that it goes back to what we were speaking about at the beginning of our session, and that is context. Context means everything. So that's going to bring the behavior to light. It impacts a victim's willingness to report these, and so that's another reason why we don't really see them coming in as their own cases, that they're a part of this. And it's really a part of a control behavior that is inherent in all of the various crimes and offenses that you've listed on your in your chat box there. So we're looking at the behavior, and then most importantly, as judges, judicial officers are having to assess the meaning of that conduct from the victim's perspective in order to determine whether or not that can constitute sufficient grounds under the statute to grant some protection. It gives us an opportunity when it's embedded in these other cases to really, if we're in a position, depending on the kind of case that judges are presiding over, to offer relief and protections that are a little bit more comprehensive than simply looking at addressing the main offense that's alleged. So it's a comprehensive view. It takes into account a significant weighing of context, and really has us pay attention to the kind of behavior that we're seeing. It's a little bit like reading between the lines, and again, always reminding ourselves that while each of these incidents may not seem offensive, may not seem threatening or harmful in and of themselves, it's when you add them all up where it starts to matter and make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you, Judge. I want to turn now to how stalking does intersect frequently with other crimes. You saw the other list of crimes that the Stalking Resource Center has come up with. But when we look at the research, I think it's so interesting to see that nearly a quarter of all stalking cases will involve some type of damage to property. And just think to yourself, what is, at least in your experience, what has been the number one piece of property to be damaged? Did you all think a car? I'm sure you did, because that not only is the answer, but that's always the answer that I get as I travel across the country. So I think that's pretty a good piece of information to know, is that nearly a quarter of cases will involve that criminal damage to property. I saw some of you typing that in as well. It's important for law enforcement. I don't know if we have any law enforcement officers who are listening today, but if there are, that really should be something that you kind of take and tuck away, because when you're responding to those slashed tires or that brick through the windshield or the keyed door panel, it's something to then say, well, wait a minute, you keep saying you know who did this, you just can't prove it. Because as a former prosecutor, that's what I always used to have. My victims would say, I know who did this, I just can't prove it. But then go a step further and say, how do you know who did this? Is there someone who wants to hurt you? Is there someone who has been doing other things that has led you to believe that that's the same person? And so really starting to go down that line and, again, put the pieces of the puzzle together. Otherwise, you're just going to charge that, that criminal damage to property and move on.
And just a quick footnote, sorry to jump in there, Elaina, but again, that goes along with a stalker's real skill, if you will, in creating repeated coincidental incidents. So they make it seem like, oh, this is unrelated or this is nothing here, and then, again, the context and how you're seeing them show up and it is making and can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, I'll just add one last thing as well. Unfortunately, it's usually that incident, that's the time that the victim will reach out to law enforcement. So maybe this behavior has been happening for 6 months, a year, 2 years, however long, but it's not until that criminal damage to property or something like that where the victim finally decides to contact police. So that may be the very first interaction that that victim has with the criminal justice system in general. If you look at the rest, you can read all about that, the attacks on the victim, attacks on the pet, very similar to domestic violence. We see identity theft a lot, as Judge Berns mentions. This is, a lot to do with power and control. So whoever is kind of controlling those bank accounts or has access to them, they will take advantage of that. And we see a big correlation between stalking and domestic violence. And I know, based on what you all have been typing, and I've been reading some of your notes, that you're getting this, that you're seeing this, and you're actually right on point with all of the research. So when we look at the research, we see that about half of all of our stalkers, half, will be a current or former intimate partner. That is a huge piece of information to know. So anytime you're hearing those domestic violence cases or those protection order cases, and you know there's been some type of history. And I was just reviewing some more research this morning before today's webinar, and one of the things that I remembered as I was reading it is that when there has been some type of sexual relationship between these two people, so yes, they're intimate partners, but where you have a sexual intimacy going on, those are the stalkers that tend to be more violent. So intimate partner stalkers tend to be more violent, but where there's a history of sexual intimacy, those stalkers tend to be more violent as well. But you can see it breaks down, acquaintance, stranger, but generally speaking, half of all stalkers are going to be that current or former intimate partner. When we look at the research, we see that 3/4 of women who experience stalking-related behaviors experienced other forms of victimization, sexual, physical, or both. And over 80% of stalking victims who were stalked by their intimate partner reported that they had also been physically assaulted by that partner. So on this next slide, and I don't want you to misunderstand my intentions here, this is a joke that came out in one of the newspapers recently. It says, I told her there ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough to keep me from her. But there is a stalking law strict enough, it turns out. And I put this in because I think it's such a great example, and I think something that Judge Berns, you're going to touch on, about how stalkers, especially if they've been that intimate partner, they feel completely justified in their behavior. They believe that they are just expressing their love, and they're going to come to you. They're going to come into the courtroom, and they're going to say, but Judge, I wanted her back. I loved her. I just was trying to show her how much I loved her. Because a lot of the text messages, a lot of the emails, they may not be threatening. They may not be at the level at which any person would be afraid. They may just be simply, I love you, I want you back, we're soulmates, why won't you talk to me, I've called you 5 times, why won't you listen to me? It's things like that that I think, sometimes as human beings, we kind of get wrapped up in what we think the victim should be feeling. But as Judge Berns said, you have to put this into context. If you were receiving 200 text messages a day, even if they all said, I love you, you might start to be fearful of that person. So our intimate partner stalkers are our most dangerous type of stalker. All right, and this is all based on the research. So they are more likely to physically approach the victim. This makes sense because they've been in that intimate space with the victim, so they're more likely to physically approach. That's not a problem for them. They're more insulting, interfering, and threatening. As I mentioned, they are more likely to use the weapons. They escalate their behaviors quickly, and they are more likely to reoffend. So remember the 60%? These intimate partner stalkers will recidivate at a higher rate than that. These are some red flags that I think are just worth noting. Those of you who have been doing this for a while, I'm sure these look familiar. But where you have all three, so jealousy, direct threats, user of illegal drugs or even alcohol, where you have all three of these combined, the risk of stalking violence is heightened for that victim. So if you have a situation where that person seems to be jealous of the victim's relationships with others, and it could even be with her mother or her sister, that is a red flag that we need to be watching for. All right, so here is a quick poll for you all to test your knowledge. At what point in an intimate partner violence relationship, so this is an intimate partner relationship where there is domestic violence occurring, at what point do you think you would start to see stalking behaviors? Do you think it's A, before the relationship ends, you would start to see stalking? B, after the relationship ends, that's when he or she starts the stalking? Or C, both before and after the relationship ends? Okay, you're coming in.
Yep, the numbers are changing.
Okay. I think we're leveling out here. So about 8% of you think before, about 2.5% of you think after the relationship, and almost 90% of you think it's going to be, and we can go ahead and end the poll, Alicia, and exit out. But about 90% think that it's going to be both before and after. And truthfully, you all of you are correct, no matter which one you chose. But those who chose both before and after is just slightly more right. And that's what the research shows. So basically, those of us who are lawyers, we don't do math, but this is pretty easy. If you look at the 21% of victims who said yes, in that relationship with the domestic violence, there was also stalking. And then the 36% that said, yeah, it started when I was in that relationship, but it also continued after I left that. So it's slightly more than half of victims say that, the stalking occurred in that relationship. And this is going to be important in just a moment. I hope this goes without saying, but previous abuse indicates a higher lethality risk. Previous abuse arrest indicates a higher lethality risk. But I really hope we all know that if we ever look up someone's criminal history, or those of you who are judges when you're handed that report, just because there is a lack of previous arrest does not lower the risk of harm for that victim. And I think that's just so important to know. A lot of times, look up someone's criminal history, there isn't any, and so we think, I think automatically that they're not posing as great of a risk, but that just isn't true. And again, it's because it's either an underreported crime or it just has never been charged, ever. Judge Berns, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think that it goes to what we've been saying about the motivation of a victim to report it, to even call the police on what they feel is inappropriate and what's harmful and what's constituting stalking, is that in and of itself, the action, if it's not, a brick through the car where someone can physically see something, if it's, 200 texts in the day, they're not likely to file any kind of report. And by the time they get to the brick through their car window, they may have endured a significant period of time where the behavior has been repeated over and over again in different, using some different tactics, and that just doesn't show up, or it doesn't come forward in their reporting. Not only because it seems insignificant in and of itself, but just because how they're being received with that information is really dismissing the bigger picture, which is critical.
Yeah. When we look at the correlation between stalking and lethality, that also is pretty high. I am sure this goes without saying too, but in 76% of the femicide cases, that's the killing of women, usually by their intimate partner, in 76% of those cases, there had existed at least one episode of stalking prior to that woman's murder. And that number goes up to 85% when we look at attempted femicides. When we look at the research around lethality and victims who had been physically abused, we see that nearly 70% of the femicide victims who were murdered had experienced physical abuse. And what's interesting, and this is really key here, of that 70% of the women who experienced that physical violence, almost 90% of that 70% had also experienced stalking behaviors prior to their murders. And so what this means is that when you have physical abuse that is occurring in that relationship, or post-relationship even, when you have physical abuse and you identify, whether it's charged or not, you identify that there are also stalking behaviors. Those two combined create the greater indicator of potential lethality than either of these by themselves. Both of them can, lead to lethality, but when you have the coexistence, your victim is at a greater risk for lethality than either of those by themselves.
I think from the psychological perspective, and so much of this is about that, we also have to appreciate the fact that from the stalker perspective and the perpetrator of these crimes and offenses, it's very affirming for them to have each of their incidents go without any consequence, go without any reporting. And it creates a very concerning momentum, if you will, in the behavior. And when you couple that with the fact that, and we go back to the recidivism slides and comments, that these stalkers are really disregarding any consequences whatsoever. because they get so attached to each and every incident and the momentum that they're getting. And that goes right into this, increased risk and seeing this over time. And I'm sure for a lot of first responders, law enforcement officers in particular, depending on the size of community you have, you may have individuals that you know in the community, and you're very clear on the history that they come with. And so when there's a call-in or there's a report, again, you have that context. For others that are in larger communities, that may not be the case. And similarly, for judges that are presiding in smaller jurisdictions or in rural communities, they're going to have repeat offenders or individuals coming into the court on different kinds of cases where they're seeing this kind of behavior and the increase in risk to victims and to families and to children.
Yeah.
So I think what would be really wonderful in terms of our time is to move into some of our case studies and give everyone an opportunity to think about some specific facts and how the stalking might be playing out, and get some feedback and some discussion going if we can through our chat. So we first want to deal with it's a criminal matter that comes to the court. The defendant is charged with stalking under your state statute based on 7 instances where he was parked outside an elementary school to watch the victim as she picked up her 10-year-old child. And there's no relation between the child and the defendant. The victim testifies that the defendant is an ex-boyfriend who is engaged in these actions due to a bad breakup between them and has made it clear that she doesn't want to see him. The victim further testifies that the defendant's repeated surveillance did not cause her to fear for herself. However, the victim testifies that she was seriously fearful about the safety of her child and how the defendant's actions might be impacting the child who had never cared for the defendant when they were dating. You're the fact finder and find the victim to be credible. So if you're a judicial officer or if you're someone who would like to put themselves in the seat of a judicial officer, this is a bench trial, so you can't fall back on the determination of what your jury would have to say. The question is, should you convict under the stalking statute? And you can use there we go, on our poll. Okay. Still have a lot of you that are contemplating the facts here. All right. Let's take a look at where everybody sits at this point. There's a good portion of you that would say, yep, I would convict. And then there's also a good portion of you that would say, you know what, I need some more information. So for those of you who are in the I need more information category, if you can type in, just generally speaking, what kind of information are you wanting? What are you missing here? What's the tipping point? Okay, so some people want to know how the child's responding. Is the child fearful or not? More history, more behavior. So you need more than 7 times parked outside the elementary school. Oh, you want to know if there's any prior arrests. And why, okay. Okay, so just about like who's really fearful here, and a little bit more history. Someone wants to know about some prior arrests and some protection orders that may or may not be in place. So I'll just toss out a couple comments, and then Elaina, I know you can follow up as well on this scenario. Remember how we were talking about earlier in terms of, if there's a history in terms of prior arrests or protection orders, you may never have that history that's documented. So you may not have the benefit of police reports. You may not have the benefit of prior arrests or even protection orders. Again, for all the reasons that we've indicated, that might not be available to you. So just be careful if that's what you're looking for in terms of making a determination whether this is stalking that you would proceed on. The other of you who are wanting more information really had to do with, well, who's afraid here? And again, if we think about our definition generally, we're looking at a course of conduct. It's directed at a specific person. It creates an implicit or an explicit threat and induces fear or concern for personal safety or the safety of close others, like the safety of a child. So in that instance, it's not dispositive that you have a child that's fearful, even though we're given information in this scenario that the child never really liked this person. But you do have the ex-girlfriend, who's still very much in the mind of the ex-boyfriend, who is the target here. And that stalker is really working to play in on use of children, use of an environment to get to that victim. And you'll remember the chart that Elaina brought up, the 4 quads on that. So those are some thoughts on that. Elaina, do you have some additional thoughts based on people's comments about what more they would like to see?
Yeah, just one. I mean, when I look at this, 7 times is going to constitute your course of conduct or pattern of behavior. There's no statute that says the acts that make it up have to be completely different. So the 7 times of being the same behavior, that's perfectly fine. And I just want to echo what you said, Judge Berns, that most stalking statutes, and I can't think of one off the top of my head that doesn't, most stalking statutes include fear of family members or third parties, basically. So I'm just looking quickly at like the Delaware statute. It does say that this person, a reasonable person, would, number 1, fear physical injury to himself or herself or that of another person. And so again, just because the mom isn't fearful, she is fearful of what this person could do to her son. And so I think under those circumstances, and again, this has nothing to do with the person's criminal history or if there's a protection order or blah, blah, blah. It's really just that this mother is afraid for her child. And to put this a bit more like in perspective, how this might even come in, a lot of times victim advocates will be working with victims who, again, will say, well, I'm not scared for myself. I don't think he would ever really do that. But then when the victim advocate says, well, if that's the case, your son comes home every day and is, by himself. If you came home from work at 5 o'clock and realized that the defendant's car was parked in the driveway and he was with your son for the last 2 hours, would you be afraid? And usually victims will say, well, yes, absolutely. So again, just trying to, I think, provide that context. And victims may say they're not afraid for themselves, but we just kind of need to do a little bit more digging on that.
Right. Go ahead.
Last one.
Right. So let's take a look at on the civil side where we're going to be deciding on issuance of a protection order. Melanie petitions the court for protection order against Ron. She testifies that she and Ron had an affair at work for nearly 2 years, but she broke it off 1 month ago after her husband found out and threatened divorce. Melanie says that since then, Ron has been sending her flowers at work and sending her emails telling her how much he loves her and wants to be with her. 3 days ago, Ron posted a message on social media that said that they were soulmates and she belonged to him. Melanie says that she has now started getting text messages from Ron, including when she's at home with her husband, and wants Ron to leave her alone. She says that she isn't afraid of Ron, but worries what he might do to her husband since she's told Ron she's not getting divorced. Should you grant the protection order? So let's take a look at your A, B, and C options and see where everybody comes down. It looks like a majority of you here, sort of 75% of those that have are dialing in, if you will, are saying, yes, we're going to grant the protection order. There's a few of you that say, you know what, she's not afraid, and so therefore I'm not going to grant the protection order. And then there's others that would still like a little bit more information. And that's fair. But I think hopefully what you're learning about all of this information in part is that, you know, who has the fear and can you have fear for others? And again, as Elaina was indicating, a majority of the state statutes indicate that you can have fear for others and families around you. I think there was somebody up in Canada who had indicated in a comment that it was very clear with their laws that that could be, that transference would apply. You know, I think that a couple of important factors. One is that in a stalking situation, you have an individual who has communicated that they do not want the contact. So that's really the first starting point, is that in the last scenario that we looked at, it was the ex-boyfriend, someone that said, you know, we're not together anymore, I don't want to be with you. In this situation, it's where Melanie is saying, you know what, I'm going to call this off, I don't want this, I'm not divorcing my husband, I don't want to be with you. And so the stalker has received the communication from the individual that contact of any kind is not wanted. And yet they are performing this series of behaviors and really creating a pattern that flies in the face of that. And they're not doing it, again, you have to look at the context, for a legitimate or lawful purpose. And again, you have to look at a whole, because each individual act or behavior or incident isn't really going to look like much of anything at all. Just a quick example, and then Elaina, I'll let you wrap up with some great comments that I know you have on this, and that is, I had a recent case, if we think about different ways that individuals can communicate, and this involved Facebook. For those of you who are familiar with it or on Facebook, I'm not on Facebook, but I'm familiar with the fact that Facebook will offer up little anniversary notes for you, like a year ago today, look, here's the picture of where you were, or 6 months, this is what you were doing. And I had a case where it was clearly communicated from one party to the other that their relationship was over. There was a series of what in and of themselves was seemingly fairly innocent type of behavior. And I also had this individual sending the victim these Facebook anniversary pictures of them. Look at, here we were a year ago. And you know, we all may be doing that and seeing that. And so when we look at that, it's like, hey, you know, I know what that is. That's not a big problem. But again, when it becomes a part of a pattern of behavior that is unwanted, that's where the concerns come in.
Yeah, and that is such a great example, Judge. I remember when you told me that just a few days ago. And for those of you who are still with us, thank you. I hope you do take a lot of what Judge Berns has shared, especially that last example. It's such a great example about how something that seems so benign really does play into the context of what a stalking case is. I know we are about out of time. We're a couple minutes over. So I'll tell you what, I want to just open it up for the next maybe minute to see if you all have any last questions, especially having Judge Berns on the phone with us. Again, we want to thank Judge Berns for her time. I know she's extremely busy, currently a sitting judge. So thank you, Judge Berns. And if we do run out of time, Alicia, I don't know where we stand on that. You all have my email. Let me go to the next slide. You all have my email. Let's see if I can get there. There it is. You can email me directly. Again, we are a technical assistance provider. This is why we're here. And if I don't know the answer, or if you specifically would like me to send something to Judge Berns for her feedback, I will certainly do that. So it's just eroberts@ncvc.org. And with that, let me just turn it over to Alicia to see if we have time for questions.
We are just about out of time, but there are some general questions that came through, and we will be sending out a notice to all registrants after, so maybe I can send those to you and you can type out a nice thorough response to a couple of the general questions that we received.
Yeah, that would be great. Can I just give the notice that part 2 of this webinar series is occurring on Friday, August 11th at 12 p.m. Eastern. So I hope you all can join us for that one as well.
All right. Thank you all for attending. We're going to close out now. You will be directed to an evaluation. Please fill that out and let us know if you have any other questions. If you would like a certificate of attendance, you can also fill out the evaluation and request one there.